One important skill of coding is being able to trace variables through a program. This is useful in troubleshooting your own code. It's useful in it's essential really in understanding other people's codes and in general, in order to be able to read a code. Just like to read English, you need to understand vowels. To read computer code, you need to understand how to trace variables. So the idea is we're looking at a code here, and as we get a variable, we are recording it. So names right now equals Lucas. Okay, so we have a new variable declared. It's names, and it's a list of 4 strings. So I've put that there. Um, my next variable that comes up is I. And what's the initial value of I here? It says for I in names, we're going up to position 3. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. So notice the list that we're doing a for loop over here, first of all, is not the entire list. It's really just this portion of the list. That's what this little extra part, if we had just said for I in names, we would be iterating, we would be doing a for loop, four iterations across this entire list. But here, by going up to and not including index 3, we're not including so on. Again, this is index 1, 0, 1, 2, and 3, and we don't include the ending position. So that's I originally is the first name in our list. So I at this point in the code actually equals Lucas. And then we move on to the next line, and we have K equals a blank string. So those are 2 single quotes there, and maybe I should have done them a little closer so you know that there's not a space there, but that's fine for now. And now we have for J in I. Now here's where if you weren't tracing it, it would start to get really confusing. So for J and I, well, what's I? I is the string Lucas. So now we're doing a for loop over the characters in Lucas. So right now, J equals the capital L. It's the first character in I, in this new for loop, this nested for loop that we're going over. And then we have K. Oh, sorry, we already have K. K plus equals is the same as K equals the old version of K plus, this is just a fancy shortcut way to write this code here. So how does this change the value of K? Well, in order to know how K changes, we need to know the old value of K, which is just a blank string, and then we need to know the 0th index of I, which is that capital letter L. So K, the value of K has now changed, and it is now, by the way, remember single quotes and double quotes is equivalent in Python. That doesn't change. So we've added that L now to K. And now we go back. We've completed this step. So we go back to the inside for loop for J and I. And J is now changing. So now J is equal to the next letter of I. Again, this would be very confusing if you weren't, it's enough confusing as you're writing it. But as you're writing it, you're just kind of doing it robotically. Okay, so now we go back down to here, and K is the old value of K plus whatever this is. Well, this hasn't changed. I hasn't changed. The value of I is still Lucas. And so now the new value of K is the old value plus the first letter of I. And then we go back here to J. This now becomes C. We're going over I. We've already hit the L and the U. Now we're in the C. As we go in here, K is the old value of K, which is that double L, plus the first letter here. So this is now going to become L, L, L. And I think you're maybe at this point starting to see the pattern. Now J becomes letter U, which is, oh, sorry, that's A, which will become an extra L, 2, 3, 4, and then the next time through the loop, it'll become an S, so we're looping over I, and that value of K then will become L, 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 L. Okay, and then at this point, so as we finish up the fifth for loop here, the value of I, we're still inside our very first for loop in the outer loop. So our value of I is still Lucas. Our value of J is now a lowercase s. And our value of K is this string of 5 L's. So now as we move, we're done with that particular for loop because we've gone through each of the 5 letters in I. And we go down to here to print I, J, K. So you'll have a space for your variables. And then you'll also have a space when you're doing tracing for your shell. What actually gets printed to the shell. And here we have print I, J, K. So I would be Lucas. And then there's a space. Then J would be the letter S. And then K would be the 5 L's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now that was all the very first loop of the for loop. So then we'd go down to the second for loop, and now the value of I is going to change. We've completed Lucas. Maybe you put it like that. Completed Lucas. The value of I now changes to Duncan. And you can go through this. I think you'll maybe see the pattern at some point that it's going to be Duncan, and this will be 6 D's, and so on. Let's take a look at this then in code. And so you would continue that out until you have everything printed on the shell, or the computer entirely run. And remember, we're not doing Sol, so really the last thing we should see is Kayla, and this would be A. This is the last letter of Kayla's name, and then the number of letters in her name would get that initial letter of Kayla. Again, this would have been hard to find, this figuring out what the output of this code is without tracing the variables. Now let's go ahead and take a look at when we paste this. Ooh, that's ugly. Let's see what happens when we paste this in idle. So I'm going to open idle here, new file, this. Okay, wow, very nice. So we have exactly, I think, just double checking. Sometimes when you cut and paste, little things change, but it looks like things carried over pretty nicely here. So if I run this, blah, 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 should I hit my A? And our shell gives us the output, Lucas, S, 5 L's, Duncan, N. So we got the output we expected. So one other tool, you can do this by hand, this variable tracing. Another thing that you can do is if you open up, there's a couple different versions of this online. I go to pythontutor.com. And this lets you essentially trace the values, but you don't have to do it by hand. You can see what's going step by step. So I'm going to start visualizing my code now. I'm going to type the code in, or cut and paste in this case, and then I want to visualize execution. So notice here is the shell, and here is the variables. So as I click next, we can see where I am in the code. We can see that names, the variable names was created, and it was assigned to this value here. We go next. Now I is created. Notice that this is very similar to what I was doing by hand. It's just keeping track. The only thing is you don't see the previous, unless we want to go back, but we don't see the previous values of each variable because Python doesn't remember them. You can't say, as far as I know, you can't go back in a previous value of the variable. There is a garbage collection system, and I'm not quite sure how it works. If there's some way of overwriting that. But in general, once you overwrite a variable, all you have is the current value of that variable. And so you could just click through, and not only do you see where you are in the code, but you see what's happening here. And let's go at least until, okay, there's our first print output. So this is what's happening in the shell. And if we go all the way to the end, you can see that we end up with that that same output to our shell. And the very final set of values for the variables, names hasn't changed. It's still the original list. The very final time through the loop, I was equal to Kayla. K, as it went through that internal for loop, ended up with 5 capital Ks, and J, as it ended that loop, was a lowercase a. So you have several different options for how you trace the code. It's good to be able to do it mentally with pencil and paper, I think, but also Python Tutor can help you. And certainly running the code itself is useful for seeing what's happening. But sooner or later, you're going to get a code that's not running because there's an error or it's not producing what you expect it to. And that's where you have to really dive in. It's like the mechanic, when the car goes wrong, they have to lift up the hood and kind of trace what the problem might be. You're doing the same thing with a set of Python code. So very valuable skill worth practicing. I'm going to put a kind of basic sheet and a more advanced sheet on Moodle. I'd like everyone to at least go through the basics sheet, and I have solutions for that. And if you feel like it and you want to see if you really have the handle on tracing, you can feel free to go through the advanced sheet as well. Right?